They tell you democracy was born in Greece, that the founding fathers invented freedom from scratch, that the United States Constitution was a miracle plucked from the minds of European philosophers. That is the story they want you to believe. Here is the truth they buried. In the forests of what is now New York, centuries before Columbus ever touched a wave, a nation of farmers and warriors built one of the oldest living democracies on earth. Women elected their leaders. Leaders could be removed for misconduct. 5 warring nations bound themselves under a single constitution, without a standing army, without prisons in the European sense, without kings. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, the empire that taught Benjamin Franklin how to unite 13 quarreling colonies. And when the United States won its independence, George Washington repaid that debt by burning 40 Haudenosaunee villages to ash and erasing their name from the history books. This is the story of the greatest theft in American history, not of land, but of an idea. Before we jump into today's story, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Follow me as we uncover the hidden battles, secrets, and legends of history that textbooks never tell you. Before the United States, there was a civil war that lasted generations. Before the Constitution, there was a man who appeared from nowhere to end it. And before Franklin or Jefferson ever wrote a word about freedom, an empire in the North American forest had already solved the oldest problem of politics: how to stop people from killing each other. The year is uncertain. Archaeologists and oral historians debate the date. Some point to 1142 CE, tied to a solar eclipse recorded in Haudenosaunee tradition. Others argue for 1451, based on wampum belt chronologies. Some historians debate the exact date of the Confederacy's founding, with estimates ranging across these centuries. What is not debated is this: for generations before that moment, the 5 nations of the Iroquois, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca had been locked in a cycle of revenge killings that made peace impossible. A death demanded a death. That death demanded another. Entire villages emptied for war parties. Cornfields burned. Women and children taken. There was no central authority to stop it, because no central authority existed. Then came a man the Haudenosaunee call the Peacemaker. According to the Great Law, the oral constitution still recited today, Decanawida was born among the Huron people, north of Lake Ontario. He traveled south in a stone canoe, a detail that scholars believe symbolizes his arrival from the spirit world. He was not a warrior. He was not a chief. He was a diplomat, with a single radical idea: that the 5 nations could bury their weapons under a single law and never raise them against each other again. The first nation he approached, the Mohawk, nearly killed him. The second, the Oneida, listened but did not act. The third, the Onondaga, was led by a man named Tadodaho, a chief so twisted by violence that oral tradition describes him with snakes in his hair and crooked fingers, symbols of his corruption and cruelty. Tadodaho was the obstacle, but the Peacemaker had found an ally. His name was Hiawatha. Yes, that Hiawatha. But forget Longfellow's poem. The real Hiawatha was no romantic figure. He was an Onondaga man who had lost his daughters to the very blood feuds the Peacemaker sought to end. Grief had made him desperate. Desperation made him brave. Together, Hiawatha and the Peacemaker traveled from nation to nation, building a coalition of clans who were tired of burying their children. The turning point came at Onondaga Lake. According to the Great Law, the Peacemaker confronted Haudenosaunee directly. He did not defeat him with weapons. He combed the snakes from Haudenosaunee hair, a metaphor for cleansing his spirit of vengeance. He straightened his crooked fingers, a symbol of restoring justice. And then, the Peacemaker offered Haudenosaunee the highest position in the new government, the first chair of the Grand Council. Haudenosaunee accepted. And at that moment, a brutal chief choosing peace because peace gave him more power than war, is the founding miracle of Haudenosaunee democracy. It was not naive, it was not sentimental, it was political genius. The 5 nations gathered at the base of a great white pine. They dug a hole. They threw their weapons into it. A river was diverted over the hole so that no one could ever dig the weapons up again. Then they planted the tree of peace on top. The great law of peace was not written on paper. It was woven into wampum belts, shell beads strung in patterns that encoded 117 articles of law. Each belt served as a mnemonic device, a treaty, a constitution. Keepers of the wampum memorized every single pattern. If a belt was damaged, the law survived in living memory. This was not a loose alliance. It was a binding constitution with separation of powers, checks, and balances, and something no European nation had, the right of the people to remove their leaders. We will get to that in a moment. First, understand the scale. The Great Law united 5 nations who had been at war for longer than anyone could remember. It created a single council of 50 chiefs, sachems, each representing a specific clan. It outlawed revenge killings. It established a formal process for resolving disputes, and it worked. For 600 years, the 5 nations never fought each other again. That is not myth. That is documented history, confirmed by archaeologists who find no evidence of inter-Iroquois warfare after the founding of the Confederacy. No mass graves, no burned longhouses, no arrowheads embedded in the bones of rival Iroquois. The Peacemaker did something the Greeks never managed, something the Romans failed at, something the Europeans of 1142 CE could not even imagine. He turned enemies into relatives. And then he vanished. Oral tradition says he paddled away in his stone canoe east toward the rising sun, never to be seen again. But his constitution remained, woven in shells, rooted under the tree of peace, waiting for a printer from Philadelphia to discover it 6 centuries later. Rome had an emperor, England had a king, France had a sun god named Louis. But the Haudenosaunee had something far more dangerous to the old world, a government designed to prevent anyone from seizing too much power. Let us walk through the machine. At the top sat the Grand Council, 50 sachems. Each nation had a fixed number of seats. The Mohawk had 9, the Oneida had 9, the Onondaga had 14, the Cayuga had 10, the Seneca had 8. These numbers were not arbitrary. They reflected population and political weight, and they were permanent. No nation could demand more seats. No nation could lose seats in war. But here is where the machine becomes revolutionary. Those 50 men did not inherit their positions. They could not buy them. They were elected, and not by other men. Among the Haudenosaunee, political authority flowed through the female line. Each clan was led by a clan mother, a woman chosen by her family for wisdom, character, and knowledge of the great law. The clan mothers held the real power. They nominated candidates for the 50 sachemships. They interviewed them. They consulted with other clan mothers. And only then did they appoint a chief. If a chief failed, if he grew corrupt or cowardly in war, or ignored the people's needs, the clan mothers could remove him. The Great Law describes a process where complaints were raised through war chiefs, and the clan mothers could strip the chief of his authority. He was dehorned, a metaphor drawn from the antlers that symbolized his office. A new chief could be appointed through established procedures. There was no appeal. There was no pardon. Think about what that means. In 1776, when Thomas Jefferson wrote that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed, he was describing an ideal that no European nation had achieved. Britain's monarch inherited power. France's king ruled by divine right. But the Haudenosaunee had been practicing elected, accountable, revocable leadership for centuries before Jefferson was born. And women were not just voters. They were political authorities. Clan mothers controlled the food supply, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash that sustained the Confederacy. They controlled the longhouses, which were matrilineal. A husband moved into his wife's longhouse, not the other way around. When a couple divorced, and divorce was common and unremarkable, the man left. The woman kept everything. Clan mothers also played a decisive role in matters of war. The Great Law specified a consultative process. The men would debate, then the women would debate, then they would come together. If the clan mothers judged a proposed war unjust or reckless, their influence was powerful enough to stop it. While European women were burned as witches for speaking in church, Haudenosaunee women were participating in impeaching leaders and shaping foreign policy. While European philosophers argued about whether women had souls, Haudenosaunee women were sending ambassadors to foreign nations. Let that contrast land. In 1692, during the Salem witch trials, 19 women were hanged in Massachusetts. That same year, in the Mohawk Valley, clan mothers were deciding whether to renew alliances with the English or the French. One society was torturing women, the other was governed by them. This is not romanticism. This is political science. The Haudenosaunee system was so stable that it survived the arrival of Europeans, the introduction of firearms, smallpox epidemics that killed half the population, and a century of colonial warfare. By comparison, England had a civil war in 1642, executed its own king in 1649, restored the monarchy in 1660, and overthrew another king in 1688. France had 30 years of religious civil war. Germany was a patchwork of 300 petty states. The Haudenosaunee never had a civil war after the Peacemaker, not one, in 600 years. That is the machine Benjamin Franklin would later study. That is the government he would quietly copy. But before Franklin could borrow their ideas, the Haudenosaunee had to survive the European invasion, and survival required power. They had no standing army, no prisons in the European sense, no written tax code. And yet, by the 1670s, the Haudenosaunee controlled an empire that stretched from Hudson Bay to the Carolinas, from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. How? Not through brute force alone, though they were formidable warriors. The Confederacy conquered through something the Europeans never mastered: unity. When the Dutch arrived in the Hudson Valley in 1609, they brought something the Haudenosaunee desperately wanted: guns. The Mohawk traded furs for firearms and quickly became the most heavily armed nation in the Northeast. But the Dutch also brought a problem. They played tribes against each other, selling guns to anyone with beaver pelts. The Haudenosaunee responded not by fighting each other for Dutch favor, but by presenting a united front. The Grand Council negotiated with the Dutch as a single entity. When the French tried to buy Haudenosaunee allies with better prices, the Confederacy played the French against the Dutch and then the English against both. They never fought each other over trade. They fought together for dominance. Between 1648 and 1656, the Confederacy launched a series of campaigns that historians call the Beaver Wars. The goal was not genocide, it was control of the fur trade. The Haudenosaunee destroyed the Huron Confederacy, which had been trading with the French. They defeated the neutral nation. They crushed the Erie. They pushed the Susquehannocks south into Virginia. By 1700, the Haudenosaunee were the single most powerful political and military force in northeastern North America. The English and French did not conquer them. They negotiated with them as equals. When colonial officials wanted peace, they traveled to Onondaga, the capital of the Confederacy, and sat in the Grand Council. They brought gifts. They asked permission. They understood that Haudenosaunee approval was required for any major military operation in the region. This was not charity. It was reality. In 1687, the French governor of New France, the Marquis de Denonville, decided he had had enough of Haudenosaunee power. He invaded Seneca territory, burned villages, and took prisoners. The Haudenosaunee response was immediate. They raided Montreal. They burned French farms. They cut the supply lines between Quebec and the Atlantic. Within 2 years, the French were begging for peace. The Treaty of 1689 was signed on Haudenosaunee terms. The French returned prisoners. They paid reparations. They acknowledged Haudenosaunee sovereignty over the Great Lakes fur trade. This is the context for what came next. In 1744, a Haudenosaunee leader named Canasatego stood before the colonial governments of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. The English colonies were squabbling. Pennsylvania and Maryland argued over borders. Virginia worried about French expansion. None of them trusted each other. Canasatego had watched this dysfunction for years. He had seen English colonists betray allies, break treaties, and nearly collapse into civil war. So he offered them a gift. Not land, not furs, an idea. "We heartily recommend union and a good agreement between you, our brethren," he said. "We are a powerful confederacy. By observing the same methods our wise forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power." He was telling them, in plain English, how to win. In the audience, taking notes, sat a quiet printer from Philadelphia. His name was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin did not invent American democracy. He borrowed it. And for a brief moment in the 1750s, he almost admitted it publicly. In 1751, Franklin published a pamphlet titled "Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind." Buried in the text was a line that modern textbooks rarely quote. He wrote that it would be a strange thing if the English colonies could not form a union, when what he called ignorant savages had formed one that had subsisted for ages and appeared indissoluble. The language is offensive to modern ears. But the argument was clear. Franklin believed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a working model of political unity that the English colonies should copy. In 1754, with war against France looming, Franklin attended the Albany Congress. The goal was to unite the 13 colonies for mutual defense. Franklin arrived with a plan, the Albany Plan of Union. It proposed a central government with a president appointed by the Crown and a Grand Council elected by the colonial assemblies. It was the first serious attempt to create a unified American government. Historians have debated where Franklin got his ideas, but Franklin himself left clues. He had spent years publishing Haudenosaunee treaty records in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. He had printed Canasetego's 1744 speech in full. He had corresponded with Conrad Weiser, a colonial interpreter who lived among the Haudenosaunee and served as their diplomat to Pennsylvania. Franklin knew exactly how the Grand Council worked. He knew about the 50 sachems, he knew about the clan mothers, and he knew that the Confederacy had maintained peace among the 5 nations for 600 years. The Albany Plan failed. The colonial assemblies rejected it because they did not want to give up power to a central government. But the idea did not die. 20 years later, as the Continental Congress debated independence, Franklin returned to the Haudenosaunee model. Look closely at the Great Seal of the United States. The eagle clutches 13 arrows bound together. That imagery is not European. It is Haudenosaunee, taken directly from Canasetego's metaphor that many arrows bound together cannot be broken as easily as one. Look at the United States Constitution. Separation of powers? The Haudenosaunee had it. Checks and balances? The Haudenosaunee had it. Impeachment? The Haudenosaunee had a form of it. Federalism, a central government with sovereignty over states that retain their own authority? That is the Grand Council and the 5 nations. In 1988, the United States Congress passed a resolution acknowledging that the Iroquois Confederacy influenced the Founding Fathers. It read in part, "The Confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy." That resolution passed unanimously. It was signed by President Ronald Reagan, and almost no one has heard of it. But before the founders could fully embrace Haudenosaunee democracy, a revolution intervened. And that revolution would destroy the very people who had taught them how to unite. The men who borrowed Haudenosaunee democracy repaid their teachers with fire. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, the Haudenosaunee tried to remain neutral. The Grand Council issued a proclamation of neutrality. They would not fight against the British. They would not fight against the colonists. They would stay out. They could not. Geography betrayed them. The Haudenosaunee homelands sat directly between the British forts in Canada and the American rebel armies in New York. Both sides demanded allegiance. Both sides threatened invasion. The Confederacy split. Most of the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca sided with the British, hoping to protect their lands from American expansion. The Oneida and Tuscarora sided with the Americans. For the first time in 600 years, Haudenosaunee fought. Haudenosaunee. The war was brutal, but the worst was yet to come. In 1779, General George Washington decided that neutrality was not enough. He wanted the Haudenosaunee destroyed. He issued orders for the Sullivan Campaign, a scorched earth expedition designed to eliminate the Confederacy as a military and economic power. Washington's instructions were explicit. He ordered General John Sullivan to lay waste to all the settlements of the Haudenosaunee so that the country may not be merely overrun but destroyed. Sullivan was to capture as many prisoners as possible of every age and sex. He was to ruin their crops in the ground. He was to leave nothing. 4 columns of the Continental Army, over 4,000 soldiers, a quarter of Washington's entire force, marched into Haudenosaunee territory. They burned every village they found. They cut down cornfields that stretched for miles. They destroyed orchards that had taken generations to grow. They killed livestock. They poisoned wells. By the time the campaign ended, at least 53 Haudenosaunee towns lay in ash. The Grand Council's capital at Onondaga was burned to the ground. The winter food stores, enough to feed the Confederacy for a year, were destroyed. Families fled north to Canada, walking through snow without shoes. Thousands starved. Washington's own report to the Continental Congress admitted the scale of the destruction. He wrote with satisfaction that the Haudenosaunee are now entirely ruined. Some historians, including scholars cited in modern accounts, have labeled this campaign a genocide due to its systematic destruction of a people's means of survival. Others argue it was scorched earth warfare. What is not disputed is the scale of the suffering. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, ending the Revolution, the Haudenosaunee were not invited. Their British allies abandoned them, ceding Haudenosaunee lands to the United States without consent. The Confederacy that had taught America how to unite was now a conquered nation. But here is the final twist. The Haudenosaunee never surrendered. No treaty was ever signed. No peace agreement was ever made. The Confederacy simply endured, burned, broken, but unvanquished, and it still endures today. But here is the final twist. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy never surrendered. It never dissolved, and it never forgot. Today, the Grand Council still meets. Clan mothers still appoint chiefs. The great law of peace, woven into wampum centuries ago, remains among the oldest living constitutions on Earth. The Haudenosaunee flag flies at the United Nations. Their diplomats speak before world bodies, and their children learn the same laws their ancestors memorized from shell belts, passed down through generations of fire and exile. The United States buried the Haudenosaunee contribution to democracy for over 200 years. But you cannot bury a living nation. The question is not whether the Haudenosaunee influenced America. The question is, why were we never taught the truth? Thanks for watching. Click subscribe and dive into this playlist next. More untold stories of empires, warriors, and history-changing battles are just a click away.